Before I get on with the next technical video, I have a confession to make. You know, people always assume that I've worked on Mercedes my whole life, and that's not true. In fact, my training through college was in aviation, and I trained to become a commercial pilot as well as an aircraft mechanic. And when people find out that I actually went to New Guinea in the 1970s to fly as a bush pilot, they're just like, what? You did what? How in the world did you ever come about doing something like that? Well, that's a long story, and someday I hope to tell that story, but right now I'm just going to tell you a few things that happened to Lynn and I when we had the opportunity to go and live and work in that very unique area. In 1972, we hopped on a plane out of Seattle and headed off for Jakarta, Indonesia, and then flew all the way into West Irian, that is now called Papua. And it's that large island that's located just above Australia, and it's been known for years as probably the most primitive place on planet Earth. And we had the privilege of living and working with some very unique people. These people at first appeared very primitive, but they had great hearts. They were fun-loving, and they were like any other human beings that you could work with and play with and have fun with. We had a wonderful time out there, and there's a lot of stories I could share with you. And one of them in particular has stuck in my brain for years, and that has to do with one of the first landings I made into an area, into a primitive location where people had never seen a white man. Can you imagine this? They had just completed building an airstrip. I had a Cessna that I was going to go in there and make the first landing on. I came overhead, I circled, I could see there were hundreds of people that had crowded around the top of the airstrip. I made a couple low passes, to check the condition of the strip. Came around, rolled on the final approach, and I really came in slow because I did not know the condition of the surface. And as I touched down, I rolled up to the top of the strip, and all I could see were faces of very, very primitive natives. They all had bows and spears and arrows, and I tell you, if you didn't know these people, you would be afraid, because they didn't look all that friendly when I got out of the airplane. But you should have seen them look at me. They just stared like, what in the world is this guy? And they came up to me and they pulled on my skin, and they're pinching me and they're pulling on my hair. You got to remember, their black skin have very kinky hair. Here this white guy gets out of an airplane and has, smooth hair. They were totally fascinated. And I couldn't speak their language. And they were chattering away like crazy. And then the chief, you can always tell, no matter what tribe you ever go into, there's always a chief, and you can always tell who the chief is just by the way people act around him. And this guy came up to me, he had all these beads and feathers in his hair, and he looked really important. And I had a mirror in the airplane. And I reached inside my airplane, and I gave the chief a mirror. And you should have seen him hold that mirror. He just sat there and looked, his eyes got big, and he's going, wow! He'd never seen himself in a mirror before. They didn't have mirrors. They didn't even have lakes that they could see their own reflection in. So here you're looking at a person for the first time in his life that has seen his own image. And he was just dumbfounded. And as I'm talking to the chief, I'm just kind of, doing the sign language thing. I noticed there's a couple of natives crawling around under the belly of my airplane. And these guys, got to remember, they're kind of short. They had their attire on, and they're underneath there, and they're looking up at the tail, and they're looking up, under the landing gear. And I thought, what in the world are these guys doing under there? So I talked to one of the local Indonesian interpreters. I could speak the Indonesian language, but I could not speak the local dialect. And I asked him, I said, can you find out what these guys are doing under my airplane? And he looked at him, he started chattering away, and pretty soon he got this big look on his face. He says, Mr. Pilot, they're trying to figure out whether it's a male or a female. And you could imagine what went through my mind at that point. Here I suddenly realized what I was doing, bringing this big metal bird into a very primitive culture. And at that point, I realized I really was in the most primitive place on Earth.